Guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Wednesday, May 7th, 2025, and today we are going to be talking about Donald Trump's approval rating and the support that he received amongst minority voters in the last election, and how we are seeing a reversal in support not just for the president, but the Republican Party in general as a result of his wavering approval rating that is reaching lows similar to that of his first time around in 2017. Now, on your screen right now is an article from the Cook Political Report, a good article that talks about inside the Trump slump, young Latino and independent voters sour on Trump. And it's a general trend line we've seen not just covered by the Cook Political Report, but also, too, generally speaking, by a number of different networks talking about Donald Trump's approval rating and what it looks like on the national level. You can see on Nate Silver's website, natesilver.net, they do a Trump approval rating tracker here that Donald Trump is still in the net negative. That's after a month and a half of being in the positive, the longest that Donald Trump has seen compared to the first term, but now eventually reaching a negative, very similar to that of before. But also, too, just numbers that aren't so great, specifically amongst minority voters that are translating directly into Democratic Party vote share, as well as just a reversal in support that might actually pull back many of the gains that the Republican Party was largely optimistic about after the 2024 election. When Donald Trump won by pretty massive amounts amongst different minority groups that Republicans previously had very much struggled with under the day and age of Mitt Romney and John McCain, and even Donald Trump's first time around in 2016, the expectation was that with Kamala Harris at the top of the ticket, we might actually see Democrats win back some of those minority voters. But instead, what we saw on election night was a massive reversal specifically to Latino voters we saw and Asian American voters shift in favor of Donald Trump that can only be displayed through shift maps like the ones we are seeing right here. Across the southern border, we saw, and in the Rio Grande Valley, we saw that these massive pockets that Democrats used to rely on for heavy vote share, you can see in 2016, where Hillary Clinton did very well, was in this southern region. Fast forward 8 years later and take a look at all of that blue, solid blue, might I add, areas like this where Star is a good example, or Webb, Texas. You can see Clinton wins by 52. In 2024, Donald Trump is winning nearly all but a few of these counties. In 8 years, Donald Trump goes from losing by 57, by 51, to winning in some cases by some pretty massive amounts. Remember that county, Webb, Texas, that Donald Trump lost by over 50 points? In 2024, he lost by just 2. Again, the reversal is very apparent. And a lot of it had to do with the fact that Donald Trump's approval rating was very high amongst these minority groups. These people who had been sold on, the same type of tactic the Democrats tried to rerun in 2024 and 2020 and 2016 was clearly fading off amongst different types of voters. I mean, you can see that it is the same voters, the same group of people that voted in 2016 and 2024. Very little shift in terms of population, besides a few influx numbers, meaning moving upward, as many states experience as the United States grows in population. Very little change. So it's not as if all of a sudden, all these voters from a solid red part of Texas, or a part of the country even, moved down into the southern border. No. These are the same voters that did change their minds, that were with Obama, right? That were with Clinton, arguably, right? With Democrats for a very long time, that decided that in 2020, they were a bit more apprehensive about Biden, and in 2024, were very willing to get on the Trump train. Texas had gone from a state that Clinton kept within 9 points, that Biden kept within 6. Harris lost the state by 14. That only happens when the perfect type of circumstance really develops, and what it resulted in was massive changes. And the reason I focus heavily on Texas is because I think that's where you really saw that Donald Trump's change in approval and Donald Trump's likability factor amongst Latino voters really changed the way that the state was actually going to vote. Texas, which has been invested in by the Democratic Party, they held a presidential campaign rally in Texas for the first time in a very long time in 2024, with Kamala Harris going to Houston, Texas. I mean, what we saw was that there was an investment and a concerted effort from the Democratic Party to try to at least do more in Texas. And unlike 2016 and unlike 2020, competing in Texas did nothing for the Democratic Party. And what it did actually, we saw, was that Republicans did better. Texas wasn't alone. Many other parts of this nation we saw reverses in support in favor of Donald Trump amongst minority groups. I say all this to say that Donald Trump's approval rating today does not lend itself to benefiting those minority voters that backed him in 2024. What we saw in 2024 was, again, Donald Trump did very well. In terms of making gains from 2020, even more massive than in 2016, you will find that Latino voters went from voting against him by 33 points in 2020 to voting against him by just 5 points in 2024. Young voters, ages 18 to 29, voted against Donald Trump by 24 points, in 2024 by 11. Independents, 13 to -3. Women, -15 to -8. Black voters, from -75 to -73. And in terms of where Trump lost ground, which was a lot of it was mitigating some of these fallouts that we saw, white non-college graduates, white voters, 65 plus, right? What we saw here was that Donald Trump lost ground from 2024 compared to 2020. But it wasn't enough to make Kamala Harris president, and it isn't enough to usher in Democratic victories. Because still, the Democratic coalition largely relies on minority voters. But Donald Trump's approval rating today does not build itself out to build a coalition that can win for Republicans in 2026 and beyond. The generic ballot already looks bluer than the national head-to-head between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump on Real Clear Politics on November 5th, 2024, and it certainly looks a lot better for Democrats than many of the swing state polls we saw in 2024. And a lot of it, again, can be explained. Decision Desk HQ and News Nation, they did a poll last month where they found that voters who recalled their last vote, who did you vote for in the 2024 election, that when compared to their generic ballot preference today, consistent improvements for Democrats. White voters, which already, again, we saw Donald Trump lose ground on in 2024, in comparison to the recall vote, again, meaning that some of these voters absolutely voted for Trump that are now voting for Democrats in the generic ballot. Kamala Harris, and in 2024, compared to the Democratic Party projected vote share, improves by 2 points for Democrats amongst white voters. Hispanic voters by 7, Asian voters by 8, Black voters by 8. These are substantive changes. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that Donald Trump is not as popular today as he was in November of 2024. And it is that is lost on the Republican Party. Because it is what Donald Trump is doing when it comes down, whether it is the economy or immigration or foreign policy. Voters are not largely pleased and do not believe the direction of this nation is moving in the right direction. No pun intended. When candidates are elected, when presidents are elected, the right and wrong direction always fluctuates. When Donald Trump was elected in 2016, it saw a massive downpour towards wrong and right direction starting to get closer. When Donald Trump was inaugurated and things started to look good for Donald Trump, they started to move up. But then it started to get bad. Then in 2020, COVID happened, but then Biden was elected, moved back up. Pretty close, at least in comparison to where it had been. Then things started to get worse. Biden was in a bad point. The inflation and the gas prices were doing very poorly for Joe Biden as a topic. But then Donald Trump was elected, and voters gave him the benefit of the doubt. They brought it right to around Inauguration Day and right after, to a point where they were more, at least in some cases, hopeful about the direction of the nation. But now we're starting to see the cycle continue and reverse back. Again, this happens time and time again. But Donald Trump swore up and down that on day one on the economy, voters would like it. That on day one, he'd handle foreign and diplomatic relations very well. He'd end the war in Ukraine. He'd end the war in Gaza, right? At least in immigration, he holds himself a little bit higher to a standard, but now is in the negative for the first time in this administration's history. And on the issue of inflation, it gets far worse than any other issue, but one of the main issues that Donald Trump swore he would do well on. When voters are promised on an idea and feel as if you overpromise and underdeliver, they sour on you. Donald Trump, who had been able to successfully turn around the way that people viewed him by the end of his first term, which left him with a record low approval rating at just measly 30 or 41%, at his low point 39%, negative 18 nationwide, has brought it to a point where even today it's down to -6. But as the directions get worse for Donald Trump and as his approval gets worse, you can see it in the numbers that voters that might have been all in with the GOP before or slightly on board because they didn't like Harris or they didn't like Biden or whatever it might be are now starting to sour. Now starting to say, I'm moving back to the Democratic Party. Or even if they aren't sold on the Democratic Party, are a lot less likely to vote for the GOP. And this is where you suffer losses. This is where you see that, for instance, in Wisconsin, a state that Donald Trump won in 2024 by roughly a percentage point, would then vote 6 months later for a Democrat for state Supreme Court in a race that was very nationalized. Donald Trump and Elon Musk got involved. The Democratic Party apparatus got involved. It was very much a proxy war between Democrats and Republicans in present day. And what we saw was that 70% of the Democrats winning by 10 points in Wisconsin came from a change in turnout. More Democrats turning out, less Republicans turning out. But 30% of that margin came from persuasion. Effectively, Wisconsin had seen that roughly 4 points, or 3%, of that margin, or 3% of the total margin of 100, saw a shift of being Trump in 2024, Democrats in 2025. 3 points doesn't seem like a lot. But if I remind you about how close the last election was on the House level, you'd be shocked to see that a 3-point shift can really change the map in 2026. This is the House map in 2024. Republicans 220, Democrats 215. Just taking alone those 4 points I want to show you, because I think it will really open your eyes. When you take a look at what a change can do on here, keep in mind that, again, 215 to 220, Democrats in the minority. If you shift by just 3 points, Democrats win back the House majority 224 to 211. Larger than the House majority for Republicans now. Larger than the House majority for Republicans in 22. Larger than the House majority for Democrats in 2020. This is the effect, and it is only just beginning. Donald Trump's approval rating is inevitably going to get worse before it gets better. It's going to be in a position where it hands Democrats an even bigger portion of the generic congressional vote, an even bigger portion of statewide elected officials. Democrats are going to do well. And what we are seeing is that it is minority voters returning towards the Democratic Party that is largely driving this swing back in favor of the Democratic Party. Because everything is on a pendulum swing. It goes back and forth between party, and Democrats fairly lost in 2024. But they very well could fairly win in 2026. And a lot of it is the common denominator of Donald Trump being more unpopular now and continues to be more unpopular day after day as compared to the November 2024 election, which was a big reckoning point for a lot of minority voters that may have voted for the GOP this past time, but may never again or may not for the foreseeable future. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video for you to watch, and then a playlist for my 2026 Senate election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.